Welcome to the second installment of Creating My First Comic. This is a behind-the-scenes deep dive as well as a how-to workshop series covering the process of how I created my first comic book, Seasons. Specifically, taking apart the first two volumes, Seasons Volume 1 Spring and Seasons Volume 2 Summer. As a brief side note, pre-orders for the trade paperback collections of both volumes will be launching soon on Kickstarter, so please sign up today and get caught up before the release of the hotly anticipated, years in the making, Seasons Volume 3 Fall. Part 1 of this how-to series, entitled The Idea, tackled where the idea for Seasons came from. You can listen to Part 1 in the video description below. In it, I discuss why I wanted to write a superhero story, or, at the very least, a story about a character with superpowers, how Seasons eventually evolved into becoming more of a supernatural/superhero mashup, and how I had to let a naive release schedule nightmare fall by the wayside. I knew I wanted my story to revolve around a young male character whose set of superpowers would change depending on the season of the year. I knew what genres I was going to be playing in and the expectations those garner. I knew the story would be 4 separate arcs told across 4 graphic novels. That was all settled. I had my idea for a story, but what exactly was my story? Now that I had my idea or concept, what was the actual beginning, middle, and end supposed to look like? What did I need to do in order to nurture my seed into a flourishing flower? I'm not going to guarantee that the steps I lay out next will provide a breakthrough to your work-in-progress comic book. However, they will hopefully start to get those gears turning and get what's in that imaginative mind of yours onto the beckoning blank page. Thanks to a seemingly unbreakable habit for saving sentimental items from when I was a teenager and child, I'm lucky enough to still have access to all of my notebooks and documents retracing a lot, but not all, of my own creative process for Seasons. These notes are not entirely exhaustive, but enough so to glean some valuable details. I still write down story beats, bits of dialogue, page layout and cover ideas, chunks of scripts, and all of the above in notebooks to this day because I find the outdated notebook to be forever reliable. Forget to charge your laptop, phone, or tablet? Crack open that notebook. Its battery never runs out. Get easily distracted from text messages or email notifications? The notebook will have your full attention. Looking at screens all day? The notebook will give those strained eyes a rest. I never have to worry about files getting deleted or lost, which has happened to me before with a notebook. It's no secret that I'm obviously a hardcore notebook advocate. With that in mind, I can see firsthand where my head was at the time when I first began working on Seasons. I can see firsthand what questions were the most important for me to answer. I can see firsthand what kind of story I wanted to write. So, my first bit of advice, pick yourself up a notebook so you have no excuses for not working on your story. If that's not a problem for you, pick yourself up a notebook if for no other reason than for it to be a time capsule of sorts for your story. It's also much more satisfying to scratch out dumb ideas with a pen than it is to keep hitting backspace. Just my opinion. After you've acquired your notebook of choice, it's time to ask yourself questions about your story ad nauseum. Do not leave one stone unturned. Questions are the bridges for ideas to cross before they become stories. Vomit out all of these questions and all your ideas onto the page. What happens in your story? What could happen? What are topics you want to talk about? What do you want to say or comment on? What's the setting? Does your main character have a pet? What does your main character even look like? Do you want your story to be character-driven or plot-driven or a bit of both? How many issues will it be? What kind of story do you want to tell? What kind of stories do you like? Why do you feel like you're the one to tell this story? What makes your story so special? This is all I was doing for a while before I wrote one word of the script for Seasons, but I'll admit I didn't do it perfectly, and I've since become a much more thorough interrogator of my stories. I didn't have all the answers to every question, but pushing through this part of the process was essential to understanding the identity of Seasons. Furthermore, there are instances where you won't know what to do with the character or what direction you should take a story until you're in the midst of writing it. Plans fall through and new better plans reveal themselves. What I'm driving at is to know your world and your characters as much as possible before you attempt to write about them. After all, how else would you know what to write? It appears my earliest notes for Seasons consisted of jotting down the series structure, a list of potential powers, the main character's motivations, particular calendar dates and holidays, and the cast of characters themselves. I knew from the outset that the story would be 100% character-driven and would be told from Fletcher's perspective 99% of the time, so narration was a must. Narration and exposition can be a crutch for newer writers to lean on, but I chose this route because it was the type of story I was most comfortable with writing at the time, and I particularly prefer narration in my comic books, but that's just my taste. And because I was taking upon myself what would end up becoming a massive 4-volume series that would span one entire year of the main character's life, mapping out a rough outline of the entire series seemed like the logical starting point. This outline consisted of writing down what happens in each story in a series of paragraphs rather than bullet points. I needed to know the 4 flavors of my one meal so I knew where I was heading. Spring is typically associated with beginnings, so our story would begin there, I decided. It would be an origin story of sorts where the protagonist wrestled with his newfound supernatural abilities, and he would literally be at odds with himself, or what I call his shadow self. This would properly introduce the character to the reader and assist in thoroughly uncovering his backstory. Summer, fall, and winter would then follow, and each volume would have its own arc and feature its own enemy, conflict, or obstacle for Fletcher. Seasons was going to be all about change. It's self-evident in the title, after all. Being a massive Doctor Who fan, I was heavily concerned with maintaining a sense of variety, of switching up the status quo of the series, which meant pinning down what I felt were the most exciting power sets and the kind of general conflicts the main character would face for each season. These powers and conflicts were also explicitly intertwined because whatever powers the main character was equipped with during the season would need to be able to assist him with whatever conflict presented itself at that time. For example, in Seasons Volume 1 Spring, Fletcher's control over emotion or his supernatural empathic abilities allows him to send the rampant shadow selves back into the hosts of the city's citizens. In Seasons Volume 2 Summer, Fletcher's strength ability enables him to run at super speeds and locate the avatars of water, fire, and earth across the U.S. Fletcher would fight the self, what he can control, in Seasons Volume 1 Spring, and the natural world or natural order of things, what he cannot control, in Seasons Volume 2 Summer. Fletcher's shadow self and the shadow selves of present city's citizens automatically bent the first volume towards the horror genre, whereas I saw the potential for the second volume to resemble a summer superhero blockbuster film. The conflicts and powers fed into each other. My highest priority was to use these powers and conflicts to symbolize a greater, deeper struggle and theme for the main character and reader to grapple with. Seasons Volume 3 Fall and Seasons Volume 4 Winter will continue this narrative cycle. Quick fun fact, there was a version of Seasons where Fletcher's abilities would leave him during the transition period between seasons, and he'd then fall victim to flu-like symptoms, like his physical body needed time to recover. I ended up cutting this aspect from the series because it was not a creative enough decision and slowed any momentum from arc to arc. Fletcher would be entirely vulnerable to his enemies during this time, but having his powers leave him sufficed. No need to add another layer to overcomplicate what would be an already complicated realization for the character and reader to decipher. Metaphor is at the heart and soul of Seasons. Thematically and visually, I intentionally decided to lean into that at every turn wherever the opportunity presented itself. What's the story underneath the story? It's what makes it such a trippy book. Some have described it as a fever dream, and that's an accurate assessment. I didn't know how to articulate my goals to myself as plainly as I can now, but I was noticeably obsessed with what I'd refer to as the subtext of the observable world. What if there was an invisible world underneath but alongside our own? What if an ordinary nobody could witness and experience extraordinary phenomena that no one else could? Add on the option to make Fletcher's powers invisible to the outside world, and that bolstered this train of thought. I wrote in my notebook, quote, "Each time Fletcher uses his powers, humanity is blocked on a conscious level. They don't register him doing superhuman activities. People see the effects of his powers, but not the cause. They're unable to comprehend what's occurring," end quote. This lent to Seasons feeling like a more grounded superhero story and saved me the cliched headache of secret identities involving government agencies or supervillains, and added another layer of complexity to the series. Where did these powers come from? How did Fletcher get them? This then created a plot point to reconcile as I eventually began to address these very questions in Seasons Volume 2 Summer. This possibility could then also emphasize the isolation the main character would feel, commenting on depression and loneliness, and so on and so forth. I was now building my world and the rules of my story that would grant me a playground to explore without contradicting itself, as well as building a sense of relatability for the reader to latch onto in response to Fletcher's disposition. My constant North Star I always came back to when writing Seasons was the statement, Fletcher isn't happy with life anymore. And the follow-up question, why isn't he happy with life anymore? This is Seasons in a nutshell. Answering this question honestly sums up every decision I made moving forward, and investigating the answers from every angle opened the floodgates to what Seasons eventually became. I constructed Seasons around this tentpole and built every challenge for Fletcher to resolve in light of it. Estrangement from his family, unrequited love, giving up on his dream job, being ashamed of himself. The lines of narration on page 17 in the first chapter sets the stage. Quote, he runs away, like he used to, from Kathleen, from failing his parents, from abandoning his dream, from himself, end quote. Like he used to also implies Fletcher has a habit of displaying this behavior. This isn't the first time he's run away from these things. It's just the most recent instance. How does someone pick up these pieces of their life and put them back together? How does one live a meaningful life? It was my job to find out, and if I do my job correctly, the resolution will be a satisfying one once the series wraps. Not to belabor the point, but asking yourself these types of character-defining and story-defining questions and writing down the answers in your notebook or Word doc for you to revisit will give you crucial direction. Find the North Star to your story. Then, find your story. Talking about the story of Seasons without talking about its characters from the first two books would only be painting half the picture. So stay tuned for an in-depth look at Fletcher, Fletcher's family, the Shadow Selves, Kathleen, Heath, Judith, Baker, Aiden, and Xander in Creating My First Comic Part 3, The Characters. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next video.